Welcome to this brief guide on picky eating in children. So the kind of questions and concerns that parents might have if they feel their child is a picky eater would be, why is my child so picky? How is my child's diet affecting them now? How could it affect them in the future? And also, of course, what they can do about it. So firstly, why is my child so picky? Age is an important consideration. Many children around the age of 18 months or 2 years of age will enter into a picky or what neophobic phase, fade around the 4, 5 or 6 years of age. There may be medical causes, and I'll say more about that on the next slide. Familiarity. A child may choose the foods that they've become most familiar with, and linked to that would be fear of the unknown. Strong sensory preferences around appearance or smell or taste, and particularly texture. A desire for routine. This is especially the case for some children on the autistic spectrum. And also oppositional behavior. It may be that a child is learning to refuse foods that they sense their parents or carers approve of most strongly, and the higher they sense the approval of certain foods, the more determined they are to refuse those foods. So here are some, if you like, chicken and egg examples of how different medical conditions can both contribute to picky eating, but also be caused by picky eating. So for example, a lack of iron and zinc can worsen appetite, but picky eating can lead to low iron and zinc intake. Similarly, picky eating, particularly a lack of fiber or fluid, can be a contributor to constipation, but constipation can cause food refusal. You won't feel like eating if you're constipated. Dental problems can be a cause of poor eating, obviously you won't necessarily feel like eating lots of hard or chewy foods if you've got problems with your teeth. On the other hand, frequent exposure to sugary drinks and snacks can, of course, cause dental problems, particularly dental decay, gum disease, etc. Acid reflux is also a cause of picky eating and food refusal. And really what's important is to exclude any of these potential medical causes first before considering other explanations. Just briefly to cover terminology, we often use terms like picky eating or food fussiness. I tend to prefer the term selective eating because there's less judgment involved in that. The sensory and psychological difficulties that sit behind picky eating are sometimes worth taking seriously. So to sort of trivialize them by just using the word picky or fussy sometimes isn't very helpful. So selective can be a useful term, but I recognize that picky eating is more widely understood. The more severe examples of food refusal have been more recently described as ARFID, and I'll say more about the definition of ARFID on the next slide. So I'm going to say something about the difference between picky eating and more extreme food refusal. It's true to say that both picky eating and extreme food refusal have psychological and often sensory dimensions. It's the combination of these that make it so challenging. The more extreme and long-lasting examples of food refusal have often been described as ARFID, which stands for Avoidant and Restrictive Food Intake Disorder. Some children with ARFID show relatively little interest in food, although that's not the case for all of them. And preferred foods may be needed to help a child with ARFID feel safe. Picky eating, on the other hand, the more moderate picky eating may require some of those favourite foods to be restricted. So here I'm trying to make some further distinctions between the more moderate picky eating and the more extreme examples of food refusal. I've described some differences on the left-hand side there. So whether it's just a generally picky stage that a child's going through and they're going to grow out of, or whether it's more long-lasting and enduring. In terms of the range of food that's accepted, how how wide or how limited this is, particularly thinking about difficulties with texture and also about anxiety. What's the degree of anxiety when the child is presented with a new food? And also whether a child pays a lot of attention to the fine visual details of food. Are they very loyal to specific brands, sensitive to changes in packaging, imperfections in appearance, etc.? And finally, how much are they influenced by peers? Children who are just a bit picky might be influenced very significantly by what their peers are eating and normalizing. Children with more extreme food refusal might be influenced to some degree, but probably less so. In a sense, the distinction between these two categories isn't always that important, because quite often the strategies that you need to deal with both of them are very similar, but there are one or two key differences which we'll mention as we go on. So how is your child's diet affecting them and potentially you and other family members? There's obviously the social impact, making participation in family meals difficult. Maybe going out for a meal or going on holiday might be tricky, so might school trips be. And also the financial impact with lots of food being wasted. There can be an impact on the child's physical health, such as their general energy levels or their immune system. There can be an impact on brain function and development. Generally, what's good for the body is good for the brain. So if there are certain nutrients that are missing from the diet, then that's going to affect brain chemistry and brain function, meaning that attention, mood, sleep, pretty much anything the brain is responsible for might be more difficult in somebody who isn't getting the basic nourishment that they need. And of course, there can be concerns about the future health impact if these picky eating habits are going to continue for a long time into the future. So it's worth recognizing that for all of us, whether we're children or adults, our food preferences are really just how these different influences have come together over time to influence what we choose and what we enjoy. So there's our own internal psychology. There's the parenting style, the family food culture, financial resources, and then there's these wider influences of school food policy, of any local shops, catering outlets, the influence of advertising and marketing, the influence of our peer group. And these all come together to shape how we feel about particular foods based on our exposure and the circumstances under which we were exposed to those foods. There are lots of different ways of trying to visualize a nutritious and well-balanced diet, and this is the Eat Well guide for the United Kingdom, and you can see that it's divided into different sections, different food groups, so to speak. So on the top right we have our starchy carbohydrate-based foods. The top left we have our fruit and vegetables. Bottom right we have both oils and spreads and calcium-rich dairy foods, and at the bottom there in pink is the protein foods, non-dairy protein foods, meat, fish, eggs, nuts and pulses. Outside of that, to the top right, we have an additional message around the importance of hydration, and on the bottom left we have some of the foods that don't offer anything in particular from a nutritional point of view that's essential, but just acknowledging that those foods are very much part of our food culture. And the advice there on the Eat Well guide is to eat less often and in small amounts. So now if we look in more detail at the different groups of the Eat Well guide, our starchy carbohydrates, these are usually accepted to some degree, albeit not necessarily the full variety or the ideal high fiber or wholemeal versions. There's usually some foods in this group that children will accept. These are the foods that give us energy. That's why I've shown the picture of somebody running there, and I've shown the smiley face because there's usually something in this group that even most picky eaters will eat regularly. Similarly, for calcium-rich dairy foods, for strong bones and teeth, symbolized with the skeleton there, and milk, cheese, yogurt, some of these foods are often readily accepted amongst picky eaters, not amongst all of them, but amongst the majority of picky eaters, do okay with this group generally. Sitting outside of our Eat Well guide, the foods that are high in fat and sugar and are often included as snacks, these are the foods that the Eat Well guide encourages us to eat less often and in small amounts. The predictability and flavor and texture, and also to some extent the influence of advertising and marketing, means that there are usually some foods in this group that children are happy to accept. The more challenging groups then we'll leave to last. So we've got our non-dairy protein group that we need for growth and for lots of other purposes. And the variation in texture within these foods can be particularly challenging, and the general lack of predictability. And to some extent, flavour can be more challenging as well. And similarly for fruit and vegetables. For both fruit and vegetables, texture can be a challenge. And particularly for vegetables, flavour can be a challenge, especially for some of the dark green, bitter vegetables. Some children pick up on that bitterness very readily, whereas others seem less bothered by it. So these two groups, the protein-based group and the fruit and vegetable group, are often the food groups that picky eaters have the most difficulty with. So the last two slides are focused more on dietary variety, ensuring that a picky eater gets enough nutrition from the different food groups and how challenging that can be. But it's worth also reflecting that eating regular meals and snacks is important for regulating mood, and to highlight the fact that many picky eaters who may be struggling with not eating a sufficiently varied diet may also just be struggling with not eating enough food at any one moment in time to keep them going. So for parents and carers who are struggling with a very selective eater, it's a very difficult balancing act between ensuring that the child is growing adequately, which is more a reflection of how much they're eating, at the same time paying attention to whether the child's diet is sufficiently varied so that they're getting all the different nutrients that they need for optimal health and well-being, and equally making sure that meal times are enjoyable for the child, for any siblings, for anybody else. And it's quite reasonable in the more extreme examples of selective eating for parents to be prioritizing growth rather than dietary variety. So what can you do about it? How can you influence a selective eater successfully? The starting point is to focus on modeling rather than persuasion. Very often the temptation is just to persuade, to coax, negotiate. That tends to just pile the pressure on too early when somebody's still very unsure about new foods. Often the best that you can do is simply to be modeling the foods that you want a child to develop a taste for. This is true both of picky eaters and the more severe food refusers. Appear not to care. As soon as you show that you are concerned about a child's eating, it tends to increase the level of pressure and anxiety that the child experiences around their own eating habits. Maximize exposure to the foods that you want that child to develop a taste for. So these should be the foods that the child sees most often from day to day. And ensure that the changes that you are trying to achieve are realistic ones. Don't necessarily aim for the ones of most nutritional significance in the first instance. Try and aim for change for change's sake. Small tweaks and changes to concept, to appearance, to brand, to flavour, to texture. Don't try and change everything at once. You should also consider limiting exposure to the most preferred foods. If a child is meeting their needs with breakfast cereal, biscuits, crisps, milk, they have no reason to change if they're getting enough energy and satisfaction from those foods. So those foods that may, in some senses, be part of the solution, once they become an obsession, they can also be part of the problem and need to be limited. On the other hand, with the more extreme food refusers, you may be reluctant to do this, and you may be right to be reluctant, because it may be that they need those few familiar foods to help make them feel safe, and indeed to keep them safe by giving them a regular and reliable source of energy. So some more practical and positive things that you can do. You can involve a child in food preparation, and it's worth bearing in mind that there are lots of different facets to that. And as they're involved in making decisions about food and choosing food and handling food, they become more confident with those foods. But you may just have to reassure them that the food they're involved in choosing and preparing and handling isn't for them, but is for other family members. That way it helps keep them feeling safe and as though they're not going to be pressured into eating the food once it's been prepared. Simply, you're trying to increase the level of confidence and temptation with new and previously unfamiliar foods by involving somebody in preparing and handling them. You can also try self-service dishes, self-service from shared dishes that are placed in the middle of the table. This is a good alternative to, say, constantly putting vegetables on a child's plate when you've learnt that the child never enjoys or eats the vegetables. It just serves often as a non-verbal reminder that you would like the child to eat those vegetables, and yet it's never successful, because every time you put it on the child's plate, they feel under some kind of pressure to eat them, even if you're not saying anything. By putting those same foods on serving dishes in the middle of the table on neutral territory, then over time a child can develop more confidence, feel less under pressure, and still have those foods within reach, being modelled by other family members. Sure enough, when the coast is clear and nobody's looking and the pressure's off, it's very common that the child will reach out and try one of those foods. Not at the first attempt, but after they become sufficiently familiar and confident with the sight of that food and seeing other people enjoy it. It can spike their curiosity. You can also consider micronutrient supplements. So there are things that we need in small amounts: vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids. Very often children who don't eat all the different foods from the different food groups will be short of some of those micronutrients. I'll say more about that later, and there's a separate video that you can view to learn more about that. This is just a further example I'm using here for selective eaters in terms of looking at realistic changes. So in this instance, we have a child who strongly prefers chicken nuggets, and we've described there the colour, the taste, the smell, texture, etc., various characteristics of the food, and we're using this as a planning tool to identify which food to move to next. Might it be a fish finger, roast chicken breast, turkey dinosaur, hamburger? Each of these foods have some similarities and differences with the food that you know the child already enjoys. So that's helpful just in terms of making sure the changes that you're focusing on are realistic and you're not trying to change too much at one time. So this is an important slide for distinguishing between picky eating and more severe food refusal. You can see the emojis at the top. We have some foods in the left-hand column that this particular child strongly prefers, some in the right-hand column that they particularly don't like, and that right-hand column could be a much longer list, of course, with a very selective eater. And in the middle, we have foods that, with a following wind, when the child's in the right mood and there's not much else available, you do have some experience of them eating successfully in the past. And it's important to view it in this way because it helps us distinguish between how much of the problem might be the fear of the new food, or how much of it might be that there's a more strongly preferred food that's getting in the way of them considering that food more fully. So, for example, for a child whose strong preference is for chicken nuggets, if they're given a choice of chicken nuggets or fish fingers, it's very likely they'll choose the chicken nuggets. On the other hand, with some picky eaters, if they're then presented with fish fingers or mince, if nothing else, the mince will make the fish fingers look relatively acceptable and relatively similar to the chicken nuggets, and it may serve to ensure that the fish fingers are eaten when the alternative of mince is considered. So I'm going to say a few words about picky eating and food refusal in older children. Children over 10 years of age are capable of learning about nutrition. Often we attempt this with younger children, but it's quite hard for them to have the intellectual or emotional capacity to absorb what we're telling them in an appropriate way. But as they move towards the end of primary school, there are some opportunities that open up to be able to do that. And it's important to help a child to understand that food affects them in the short to medium term. That's more motivational than the theoretical risk of problems with your heart or your bones or whatever it might be in decades' time. So the immediate impact of what we have or haven't eaten on our mood, on our energy levels, on our gut health, how we feel in general. In a sense, more the relationship between the food we eat and our immediate well-being rather than our long-term health that feels quite abstract and quite far off. We also have a desire to eat with our peers as we get older, and there may be school trips, there may be opportunities to eat out with teenage friends, for example. With younger children, it may be being able to go to a children's birthday party and eat some of the food there successfully. So as this desire to be able to eat independently with our peers develops over time, that opens up a window of opportunity whereby a child may have some new motivation to be able to eat a wider range of foods successfully. On the other hand, in spite of this newly acquired motivation, the child may still be quite ambivalent. They've eaten in the way that they've eaten for so long that they almost view themselves as being incapable of being able to successfully eat foods that look different or taste different, smell different or feel different in the mouth. So there may still be some challenges there. The key here is that really in your role as a parent, you need to be there to support that change rather than to lead it. If it seems to the child as though you're trying to lead it or push for it, then you fall into the same traps that we talked about earlier in terms of coaxing, persuading, and all those things do is add to a sense of pressure rather than facilitating change. So this slide looks at the possibility of using a vitamin and mineral supplement. Obviously, nutrition from food is ideal, and when we looked at the different food groups of the Eat Well guide earlier, if consistently there's one of those food groups missing, then there's a very good chance that the child is missing out on something important. Vitamins and minerals are the micronutrients that we need in small amounts but still critical, and they come from a variety of different foods, of course, but in particular foods from the non-dairy protein group and foods from the fruit and vegetable group provide quite a wide range of vitamins and minerals. And when a selective eater is struggling with one of those two groups, it's very likely that they're going to have less of the essential vitamins and minerals that they need in their body, in their blood, in their brain. And so it's worth considering, while you're patiently working at broadening the diet, it's worth considering using a vitamin and mineral supplement to fill that gap. If you want to find out more about which supplements to use under what circumstances, then just follow the link below on YouTube where I've done a brief guide to micronutrient supplements. Okay, down to my last slide. Just some sources of further information, really. In terms of websites, the Ellen Satter Institute is a very useful starting point for learning more about different approaches to food and health and meal times with children of different ages and stages. If you feel that your child is just a little bit fussy rather than an extreme food refuser, then myfussyeater.com has some useful practical hints and tips to work through and around the problem. And if you feel that your child fits into the more extreme category of food refusal, then the Mealtime Hostage website is quite useful. And if you're looking for a book recommendation, there's a very good one here by Gillian Harris and Elizabeth Shea, which looks both at the more moderate picky eating and also at more extreme examples, and comes up with some useful practical tips. And last but not least, if you want to find out more about the relationship between children's food and mood, then do click on this link, on this YouTube link below, for more information. Thank you for listening.